I'm Clare Reddington from Watershed in Bristol, and I'm chairing this afternoon's session. So, from pedometers to vibrators, dustbins to lampposts, there's a proliferation of connected objects available at the moment. And as they move from design fiction to retail reality, they challenge our notion of our things, ourselves, and our relationships with the environment. So as this new landscape takes place, what do we need to learn and think about in terms of human-object interactions? Is it about data? How do we design in permission, playfulness, mystery? What should the objects look like? How do we learn how to trust them? I'm joined by the very best gaggle of speakers to help me address these questions. We have software engineer and developer Dan Williams, interaction designer Alex Deschamps-Sonsino, and Tom Armitage, a technologist and designer. And they're going to speak for 20 minutes each. We're not going to sit up here looking weird whilst other people present. We're going to sit in the audience, watch 3 20-minute presentations, and then we're going to have a discussion, which I'm kind of hoping you will lead. So I'd really like it if you've got some questions ready and we have a kind of lively debate. This isn't going to be kind of about how great we are at arguing with each other. So that's your warning. So please join me in welcoming Dan Williams.
Hello. So last year, Manchester Police issued a press release that they'd found the first 3D printed gun parts in the wild. They'd done a raid, they'd found someone, they found the parts. They found these things, what they thought were the trigger and the magazine of a gun. And then a few hours later, BuzzFeed pointed out that these were not parts of a 3D printed gun. These were spare parts for a 3D printer. What they thought was a trigger was an attachment to hold the servo in place. What they thought was the magazine was a filament spool holder. And it turns out the person they raided was a model maker who just made models, and they'd arrested him. And so now when you go to this excited press release about finding the world's first 3D printed gun in the wild, it's been deleted, it's gone. I guess the embarrassment of being fact-checked by BuzzFeed does that to you. I guess they were expecting a 3D printed gun to look like a normal gun, but in reality it has a slightly different form. It doesn't quite look like a gun. It's got a slight gun shape to it. This is the one from the Science Museum. I think it's the first successfully fired gun. It shot twice, 3 times before it broke. It's this weird bulky form. It looks like, I don't know, kids' Play-Doh. It has a new shape, which kind of draws attention to it. But in reality, it's not much different from any other homemade gun. It's quite easy to get a lathe and some steel pipe and make your own gun already. It's just the fact that it looks a bit different draws our attention to it. Frequently when we kind of talk about the Internet of Things, most of the objects we encounter are going to look exactly like the objects we already have now, but they're going to behave slightly different. This is a Linux-powered hunting rifle. It looks like a normal hunting rifle, but it's a computer inside. When you look into the scope, you look into a digital screen. And when you pull the trigger, it doesn't fire. It selects the thing you're currently pointing the gun at, decides that's the target, and it then performs a series of calculations to account for gravity, wind, and it will track the object as it moves, and it will not fire the bullet until you next target the object correctly, so you're pretty much guaranteed to always hit your target. And when you pull the trigger, it also takes a photo and posts it to Facebook for you. And because it's technically a hunting scope, it's unregulated, anyone can buy and sell these, you don't need a license for the scope itself, as far as I understand. So this kind of computer vision software and cameras are quite affordable, they're quite cheap, you can put them in all sorts of things. This is an app called SceneTap. In a number of American cities like Austin, you can open this app and it will tell you, for the local bars, how busy they are, what the gender ratio are, and what the ages of the people in the bar are. And it doesn't use Foursquare or Facebook, it doesn't import this data from somewhere public. What they've done is they've installed a pair of cameras at every entrance to the bar, and it analyzes the faces of the patrons as they walk in to calculate what their gender and age is. And if you go read their patent, which sometimes I do, you'll see that They've specified that the demographic information may include a total number of people currently in a venue, the percentage capacity filled, ratio of males to females, and average age of males and females. So that's what it currently does. But it goes on with what they plan to do in the future. A ratio of hair colors of customers, approximate income level of customers, approximate percentage of race and or ethnicity, approximate averages of height and weight, percentage of people with glasses and facial hair, which hipster index perhaps, a clothing type, and general indicators of attractiveness. When we create software, we kind of like encode what we believe into it, and so this is like when bros make software. And the thing is, when you go into this bar, there's no indication that this is happening. You haven't opted into this. It just happens to you, and you're not even aware that this is being put into a piece of software elsewhere. This is the Me guides scattered around Manchester. They were installed end of last year. They're like these interactive touchscreen guides that tell you what's going on and what you can see where. And the council is quite proud that they're cost neutral. It didn't cost them anything to install them because on the other side of the monolith, it's supported by advertising, the much bigger side of the monolith. And it shows digital adverts. It shows some like smart information, like what the current temperature is. And if you look very, very closely, like very closely in the black sidebar of the monolith, you will notice there are 4 cameras embedded in them. And you have to look at the right angle with the right lighting conditions to notice them. And they're pumping the video feed of who's looking at the billboard into a piece of software called QVD. QVD analyzes your expressions, your age, gender, to work out what demographics the adverts are reaching. And this is kind of like a fair offset for building these touchscreens as a way of paying for them. But as the Pirate Party point out, they're not cost neutral. They do have a cost. It's your privacy. And so we're kind of used to seeing these kinds of systems in things like Minority Report, which has eye tracking for adverts, and it's quite a clear, simple, because the director needs us to understand it. Every time it recognizes someone, it pulses. It's quite a good visual feedback. But in reality, these tend to be hidden. That advertising billboard would rather we not know that it's observing our faces, so it disguises it into the black side panel. Most of these machines don't have a nice little indicator going, hello, I am an eye, I am looking at you. And because the cameras, they look like phone cameras, have no surface to them. You can't tell what's happening behind. You don't know what processing. You don't know who's observing, where the information is going. Is it recorded? Is it not? Is it done by machine, humans? There's just no behind to it. So I was wondering about these facial recognition software. And I downloaded a few, gave them a try on my own face. Some of them were reliable, some of them weren't. And I realized I needed a more scientific method to evaluate how good they were. So I downloaded a piece of software with the Fraunhofer Institute called SHORE, and I found a corpus of photos where the same person has the same facial expression many times. This is the Tumblr Nick Clegg looking sad. It's 60 photos of Nick Clegg looking sad. So I put them into the algorithm to work out how sad Nick Clegg is according to the machine. It fluctuates. Frequently, he's just kind of like ambivalent. There's not really much going on. When it recognizes emotions, it sometimes thinks he's happy, but even though we know he's sad on the inside. The age fluctuates from his early 20s to his late 60s. And of about the 60-odd photos I've put in, only one of them identified him as sad, this one. This is my favorite, however. David Cameron is not a valid human face. There was an interview last year with Mayor Bloomberg in New York, and in it he stated that like drones were inevitable, get used to them. But the best thing he said was that we shouldn't be too concerned about surveillance drones because they're the same as CCTV. It's a camera observing you. We already have a regulatory framework with it, and we're already okay with it. If you've got a problem with drones, perhaps you should have a problem with the cameras that already exist in the environment. Perhaps you should question them as well as these new technologies. Because when we introduce new technologies, they won't always have a new visible form. Sometimes it will still look like a billboard, still look like a CCTV camera. Even though on the backside, cameras are becoming, well, not even quite cameras. This is a system called 3D. What it does is it interpolates cameras in sports arenas and builds a 3D model of the game as it's happening. So you can change camera angle to anywhere in the stadium. It's incredible. It's kind of unclear where the edge between photo and render is anymore. Skybox Software call this building a pipeline from photons to information. So it's no longer photographs, it's information. And this is their orbital platform of satellites which record video from space. This is Beijing Airport, which you can kind of just watch if you want. It's quite nice. It's very impressive. I think maybe in 20 years you'll be able to just kind of summon up an image of anywhere you want, and if the footage isn't there, maybe it'll just render in what it thinks it's going to look like using 3D processing. So I was walking on the Brecon Beacons, where I grew up as a child, and I found this object. It looks like an Ordnance Survey trig point. But when I walked closer, I realized it wasn't. It had this plaque declaring this monument forms a part of the Ordnance Survey National GPS network. I'd always thought of GPS as this ephemeral thing in space, this kind of invisible thing, and I didn't expect to find a chunk of it on a Welsh mountainside. And it kind of led me to wonder, what is GPS? How does it manifest on the ground? And it turns out there's a large infrastructure to it. There are ground stations, monitoring stations, things like this. And then when you start to look closer at the system, you see things like these taglines, on time, on target. Because it turns out GPS isn't really a positioning system, it's a clock. It's like a really precise orbital space clock. And using the different timestamps from the different satellites and using a bit of calculation involving general and special relativity, you can work out where you are in the world. But you can also use it as just a clock. So financial exchanges for trades, they need really precise timestamps. For things like high-frequency trading, you need to know when it happened to the exact nanosecond. And to do this, they don't buy their own atomic clocks. They use the GPS signal to work out the current time. So they just kind of like listen in for free on the signal. But it turns out GPS is a really weak signal from space. It's incredibly easy to jam. So it turns out there are problems, like every day for up to 10 minutes, the London Stock Exchange's GPS signal is jammed, and they can't work out what the correct current time is. And this isn't some kind of gang of cyber terrorists. It turns out to be people buying GPS jammers from websites like Jammer for You, which is a totally legit organization. Like, they will sell you these, they'll write it's a signal booster on the box and declare it to be a gift so that you don't get stopped by customs. And the jammers are like 30 quid, and they've got buy one, get one free offers. Because in the UK, it's legal to buy a jammer, and they look like this. But what it's illegal to do is push that big red button to switch it on, which I'm not sure if I could resist. This one fits in a cigarette socket in a car, because what it does is jam the signal for people like lorry drivers who don't want their employer monitoring them or the tachograph measuring how fast they're driving. So that's one of the main use cases in the UK for GPS jamming. You can also get them disguised as a cigarette packet for if you want a discreet GPS jamming night out. With GPS, it's not just jamming you can do. If you're being smart, you can spoof the signal. You can emit fake GPS signals with the incorrect timestamps to make GPS receivers think they're in a different place than where they are. So a few years ago, Iran claimed to have done this to a US drone, kind of confused it for its current location and flown it into their territory and landed it successfully. The Americans asked for it back, I'm not sure how politely, and Iran reacted by mass manufacturing toy versions of the drone and shipping them to Obama. With wonderful inscriptions on the bottom, such as, we will step on the United States. I'm still trying to find someone who's exported these from Iran so I can buy a toy Iranian drone replica of a US drone, but no one seems to be exporting them currently. I'm not sure why. Anyway, so I decided I wanted to try and find GPS now that I knew it had solid chunks on the ground. And when I looked up GPS satellites, all I could find was like paintings, not even CGI renderings, not photographs, but like paintings of them. And occasionally, if you're lucky, you'll find a model of them, usually held by a proud engineer who's worked on the satellites. So I went hunting, and this is the closest I managed to get to a GPS satellite. I went to Florida and stood at the very edge of the Air Force range where they're about to launch one. There's a GPS satellite there mounted on the top of the Delta IV in the protective assembly building arrangement. And this is the closest they would let me get to it, which is probably fair enough, because like shortly afterwards this happened. But even if I'd gotten to that object, even if I'd gotten to the satellite itself wouldn't have been GPS. It wouldn't have been switched on for a start, but it would have to have been like 24 of them, and they would have to be in orbit, and it would have to be all these ground stations and all the people who worked on it and all the engineers. It's this vast, complicated system. It's a kind of network of objects. They kind of swarm. They're not even in a geostationary orbit. They're constantly fluctuating which ones you can see and where they are, and the orbits get changed depending on which battlefield the US are currently fighting in. So I couldn't see the whole network as a whole because it's just far too vast. So I decided to kind of build a tool, something that would let me see into the network. So I built this. It's a tiny little thing that runs on my phone, and it just kind of tells me how many are above me right now. Because the network is too large for me to comprehend as a whole, this gives me a tiny slice. And I leave this on my desk, and when the orbits change and one of them rises above the horizon, it goes, hello, there's a new satellite in the sky. And when it drops below the horizon, it says farewell. And that's all it does. It's like the most disappointing piece of software I've written. It's really underwhelming. But over time, you build up this kind of understanding of the network, this invisible thing. It kind of gives you an extra sense, an extra form of vision, the ability to see something that's invisible. But of the stories around GPS, this is my favorite. The Technology Strategy Board funded a project called Sentinel, which observes GPS jamming in the UK to work out how prevalent it is and who's doing it. And they found a village with multiple signals. And the new scientists put forward the theory that it could be vigilantes, villagers who are fed up of lorries driving into their town using sat-nav, and that they're actively jamming GPS signal to stop truck drivers coming into their village. It's a kind of collective village behavior to defend themselves. It's lovely, apart from the fact that it's illegal and wouldn't actually work, because the sat-nav would drive you there, then it would stop working and you'd get trapped in the village. But it's kind of them trying to assert their ability to control the world rather than have these technologies subjected on them. They want to control it. Kind of like how in the William Gibson Big End trilogy, the protagonists are all kind of like made to do things, and the whole narrative is them trying to discover like hidden locative artworks using Oculus Rift headsets and stuff. But really what they're trying to do is find their freedom. The protagonists are not, in the end, invested in defeating schemes to dominate global power relations, but those that threaten personal integrity. So with these, we just need to find a way to maintain our own integrity, to be able to object to these technologies and be ourselves without being subjected to them. Thank you.
Hello. Wow. I thought I'd talk a little bit about products. I'm a product designer. I'm strangely trained in something called interaction design. I don't know if you've heard about it. And it was sort of through the last few years of doing a number of different things that I've started to think about the work that we do and the work that a lot of my peers do as making gonzo products, essentially. So I was the CEO of a business called Tinker London. We were the first distributors of the Arduino in the UK. If you don't know what the Arduino is, you can think of it as the Italian version of the Raspberry Pi, if that makes sense. Don't say that to anybody who actually works for Arduino. I then closed the business in 2010 and do both consulting and also have a startup called the Goodnight Lamp, which is an Internet of Things product, a family of internet-connected lamps. And through doing the tech to the new startup and the exciting world of creative products that connect to the internet, there's a lot of challenges that present themselves, and there's also a lot of opportunities. And I thought I'd pick on one particular sort of aspect of the industry, which is the crowdfunding bit, the bit that's very exciting, that's very hyperbolic right now. Everybody's, sort of going crazy. Certainly the latest news from this year, and this year is kind of meant to be the Internet of Things year. All of the latest news from this year is about companies that are on crowdfunding websites who then get acquired and do all sorts of crazy things. So this is a ridiculous slide because this is this room and we're here. But obviously, when we talk about the Internet of Things, for me, we kind of talk about our ability to put connectivity in everyday objects that probably have never had connectivity associated with them in the past. And so some of the bus stops that Dan talked about are some of the ways in which we more publicly see this, but I see a lot of opportunities and things that actually live in your home. And let's not totally start thinking about smart products or smart homes, but as a sort of wave of things that surround you that could have connectivity. This is a map I've been working on, so you have things that might exist in your home, and there's a lot of those, things that you might wear, and then you could argue that a lot of these are just watches or just things on your wrist, and so the wearability of them is that's questionable. And then you have maker products, and then you have sort of daily, everyday, sort of urban type products, and Dan's covered a lot of that, which I won't talk about. There's a couple of different things, and this is sort of me trying to understand how we get to a stage where we now make products like this. Back in the days, the olden days, like the really olden days, you had an idea. You probably maybe worked on a prototype, maybe. More likely, you kind of made a drawing, and then you would register that, or you would patent that in some way, and you would protect that in some way, and then just kind of forget about it. Or sell it to someone, or try to make money off of licensing it off to someone. But your job as an inventor was kind of limited to that. You didn't necessarily have to put anything out there. It didn't necessarily have to make any commercial sense. And you look at, Leonardo da Vinci, that's kind of, a lot of his works kind of sits there in this level of innovation that stays on paper. The world of architecture is very familiar with this. You have this term called paper architects, people who are brilliant at building ideas that will never get built ever. And people are comfortable with that because it shows innovation in a way that is, in a bubble. And it kind of sits in this ether, in this world of, well, we know it'll never get made, but it shows that you're creative in ways that are really interesting. The world of automotive design is also full of that. So if you go to your average sort of product design graduate show, there'll be a lot of automotive designs and car designs and things with 5 wheels and 3 wheels and things you'll never see in your life because they are allowed to exist in a conceptual space that people are comfortable with. And in a way, you could argue that that's also a way of being defensive about innovation. You kind of protect something very closely, and then you allow it to thrive or not thrive. It doesn't really matter because you've made that act of protection. Then, I studied product design in Canada, and you have a sort of step beyond that, which is a step of sort of careful innovation, where you have a product idea and you actually want to see it go through and you want to see it actually on the shelves somewhere. And so you'll start by protecting it, but then you'll find partners who can help you actually manufacture it. You might actually sell the design on to someone who can manufacture it. And then you get royalties out of it, and you get sort of 5 to 7% every time someone sells one, and your job is kind of done. You might help sell it, but this is the way in which a lot of product designers sort of work and have existed for the last, let's say, 100 years, because the field is actually not that old. If you are going to Milan this week or next week, it's the Milan Furniture Fair. It'll be a lot of people who work under this particular process of, I've made one thing, I'm then going to find a furniture sort of partner to make this and make many more of this and worry about the distribution and worry about the sort of protection of the, the idea and all of that. That'll just kind of have its own life. I'll actually get closer to manufacturing it, but not all the way, not that close. And there's a lot of value in that process. The interesting thing is that this is a process which is very old of, protecting something and also manufacturing it, but it's a process that no one really talks about because it's the process of making things in an industry that just assumes everybody knows, everybody kind of understands that process within that industry. And the difference between product design, traditional product design, and what I'm qualifying now as sort of gonzo innovation is that the two communities haven't talked to each other very much necessarily. And so in gonzo innovation, or the Internet of Things, depending on which day of the week it is, you will just skip over entire processes. So you'll have an idea, you'll build a prototype, never mind necessarily user research, never mind actually finding partners to make it. You're just going to put it in front of people immediately. And that prototype could be completely conceptual. It could be sort of a half-assed sort of Arduino in a box that does a thing, but it's got a good sort of shell around it. And you're just going to go. And you're going to go to investors with that, who will go, okay, well, how many backers do you have? And you don't even know who you're making it with. You don't even know at what scale you want to make it. You're just kind of trying something out. And it's, when I talk about gonzo, I take the sort of literal meaning in the journalistic world and just kind of apply it to products. It's sort of products that don't claim to be realistic. There's no claim, there's a claim to kind of be what they are and do what they do, but the ways in which they will get done are completely sort of fictional almost at that stage, because they don't need to be realistic, because the point is that you can make something and sell it to someone, even though crowdfunding notionally is not for sale. You can sell it to an audience in ways that you never could have before, at a scale you never could have before either, while being completely unaware of what actually needs to happen after that, like the kind of, and they lived happily ever after is the point at which you finish your campaign successfully. And then the beginning of the marriage starts and all the problems happen. Not that, all marriages are like that. So for me, we're kind of creating, and I say this, being a product designer, having run my own Kickstarter campaign, having a product that I'm trying to commercialize, we're kind of creating a sort of weird mix of products. And I think that a gonzo product kind of starts its life on a crowdfunding site. Like, it almost has very little life before that. It probably, is an idea that someone took sort of 2-3 weeks to kind of put together. There's no team, there's no incorporated company, there's just an idea, there's something quick and dirty. There's also a super low goal, because the sort of key to successful campaigning on crowdfunding generally is you have to be successful. It almost doesn't matter how much you raise. You could raise $5,000. As long as you can raise $5,000 and you can look successful, that is the perfect criteria for the next stage of the kind of honeymoon period, which is essentially looking for investment after you've crowdfunded something. And unlike the honeymoon period, you don't, well, actually, exactly like the honeymoon period, you're exhausted by the end of it. And there's this idea also that pivoting is really good, and I think that pivoting is this really interesting notion that never really applied to products. Mattel didn't pivot particularly with Barbies. The Barbie looks sort of exactly like the product it's kind of always looked like, because they were convinced enough that this was an idea that would take up, that would get people interested, and they just sort of kept showing it to people and kept selling it to people over and over and over again. And Barbie, turned 50 not so long ago. No one ever, I'm sure, maybe in the beginning, in the kind of early years, but people didn't necessarily suggest, oh, you might want to try something entirely different. Usually it's more like you might want to try a different color, or you might want to try a slightly different market, or show it to a different market. But you didn't just drop everything you were doing and then move on. Whereas now it's actually proactively encouraged. Like, okay, no, clearly within 3 months, if you haven't found X number of users, you don't know what you're doing, just change what you're doing entirely. Take the team you have and try to make something different with the same team and the same strengths within that team. And that's also quite quirky and quite weird. And then the last sort of quality, I guess, of a gonzo product might be this idea of lean. Lean and lean startups are really, really fundamentally a production process in the automotive industry that then turned into a book about how the web and web startups should work, that then now is trying to reapply itself to the built environment. And that's great, but car companies and the ways in which cars are made is actually a really old sort of learning process. And people have been learning how to make cars more efficiently and make that process more efficiently for 100 years. It's not quite the same to sort of reapply that then to the physical world, where actually it might take you quite some time to learn how to make the thing that you're making really well. So it's horrible taking examples of gonzo products because it kind of points the finger to people who might be doing things slightly differently, but I hope these guys will forgive me. So the air quality egg was a product. It's an air quality monitor that you hang in your home, and it maps out the quality of air in your area and then posts it online on a map so that you can kind of track what's going on. Extremely relevant for mornings like this morning, where I left London this morning, there was smog. They kind of sold it as fog, but it's really smog. And so I kind of wish that I had something there to tell me actually what the level of pollution was around my area. These guys ran a Kickstarter campaign that was very successful. They raised the money they wanted to raise, and then ran the entire project from Google Groups, essentially. So it was a bunch of people on Google Groups who collaborated around making a small batch of these, so not very many units, 300 to 500, I think, or so. And the entire project was highly collaborative, highly distributed, and full of people who had no experience in product design. So electronics engineers, yes, but people who'd never done plastic moldings in their lives. The head of the project in terms of product was an architecture graduate, so someone who just graduated from architecture school, who kind of took this on and thought, like, yes, I can totally do injection molding, no problem. They made a small batch, they sold a small batch and distributed them. I still haven't received mine, and it's been some time now, but that's okay, because that's kind of what happens in gonzo products. You kind of, you're sort of in the wild, wild west in a way. And now the entire project doesn't really necessarily exist anymore. You kind of go to the page and it feels like the team who were behind this have now sort of evaporated because everything took part for that project, for that deadline, for that money, and there's nothing left after that. And so it's as close as you'll possibly get to a web startup in a way that involves physical atoms. A lot of the products also now are quite buggy and don't necessarily work. Not all of them, but some of them. If you have a functional air quality egg, please tweet about it. Another example of another company is called Green Goose. Green Goose doesn't exist anymore, but it was the efforts of one guy who, in the course of about a year and a half, came up with 3 different product ideas that he tried to launch over a year and a half. And so the first one was a connected toothbrush, which if you've looked at CES this year, there was a connected toothbrush being sold. So Oral-B is now kind of doing connected toothbrushes. This guy was trying to make it a year and a half ago, moved on to something else entirely, and then when I saw him last year in January, was doing Teddo the bear, which is a teddy bear that has a little Bluetooth, low-energy Bluetooth unit inside it, and when you shake the bear, a little toy on the iPad moves along. So it's kind of treating the teddy bear like a Wii controller, essentially. And he was selling this for $19.99, and the app was free. And he clearly, this was clearly sort of part of a long journey in trying to figure out what sticks. The problem is, if you talk to anybody who's been doing normal products for a very long time, what sticks usually takes about 3 years to ascertain. So a friend of mine, she's a jewelry designer. She knows that whenever she goes to a trade show every year, it will take her 3 years of that trade show before people start buying from her. Because the first year, people are like, ooh, this is new, this is interesting, but let's see if they stick around. Second year, they go, oh, you're still there. I think I saw you somewhere. And then third year, they go, oh, yes, I was planning on seeing you. Let's go. Let's do some business. And that's a relationship to consumers that I think we need to understand when we do gonzo products. It doesn't work with the sort of time cycles we're trying to match, but it's kind of how the world works, or some of the world. So in my last 2 minutes, or 3 minutes or so, this is super interesting if you're planning on doing, if you're planning on developing a gonzo product. Things you need to be aware in, and this is exactly the problem space that we're kind of thinking about. These are grand generalizations in terms of numbers, and you'll excuse those, I hope. But if you're looking for a little bit of money, crowdfunding's, the ideal place. Seed sort of funding, grants, incubators, all of that. If you're looking for a little bit more money, don't live in the UK, and go and find angels in the US. Because what you actually need is actually more than that, but there's no one in that space. It's what people call the equity gap. And then there's loads of VCs, but they really only want to talk to you when you're trying to raise enough money that is worth their while. And then, of course, once in a blue moon, some, team makes it really, really big, and people think that fundamentally disrupts that process, but I think that all it really does is do that, which is just move the entire curve back into a completely different space, where their needs are just bigger. So they raise a lot of money, but they probably have to make a lot more of the thing that was really expensive that everybody now wants, and now they have to go after some insane amount of money really quickly because they have to fulfill. And you look at products like Pebble and other types of things, that's kind of the situation they're in. Numiko, which is also a sous vide product, which is made the most money in the food section in Kickstarter. They're still, 2 years on kind of fundraising and trying to look for loads and loads of money, because with loads of orders comes loads of money. And the trick, and the reason why everybody's so interested in this, is that essentially when you're doing crowdfunding or you're doing seeds sometimes and mostly grants, no one wants anything from you. No one wants any equity from you, which makes you highly attractive if you can get a lot of money for no ownership. And the Oculus Rift thing is a perfect example of that. Everybody's going, ooh, how come Well, because you decided to give someone some money for no ownership. And that's what makes them attractive tools for investors who kind of go like, why don't you go play somewhere nice where we can figure out if you're kind of worth anything, and then we can go after a huge chunk of your business and thank you for it and just sell it off to whoever. And so I think there's like almost no time left. I'm like 2-ish minutes-ish. So this is a really sort of tricky space to be in, this kind of gonzo product space, because once you know those dynamics, you can kind of just play with them and just go, okay, well, I'm in the business of doing something for a very short period of time. It's probably going to sell to some large advertising company in a little bit, and we're just going to have a great story to tell and a great journey. And in my sense is that I think we're better than that. I think we're capable of doing more than that. This is Botanicals, which was the first internet or sort of internet-connected plant monitor. So you had a little leaf-shaped PCB, you stuck it into a plant, and you could get SMSs or tweets when your plants were sort of dying. This was run, purely as a kind of academic project, and they made money because they sold the kits through a distributor in the U.S., and Katie then moved on to, grow other businesses. But they were one of the first kind of attempts to connect plants to the internet, and now you would struggle not to find that in your average John Lewis shelf. And so that project kind of acted as a litmus test for an industry which is essentially risk-averse, which is the, consumer business. Consumer products industry is risk-averse. They don't like doing things differently because it identifies new opportunities in the marketplace that they haven't tested and they don't completely know about. And so they're the ones who are actually looking at all of these crowdfunded products and kind of figuring out, okay, well, you know, which one should we go with? Which one should we sort of poach? Because clearly there's no IP, this is just a gonzo product, those guys will be gone within 6 months, so let's just learn from their mistakes and then apply it to the businesses that we know about. So one of the perfect example of this, of course, is, and I hope Daniel won't mind me saying that, Goodnight Lamp, when we had our first kind of pre-orders, one of the people to pre-order from us was the head of marketing at Philips. And so you kind of go like, oh, I see, hello. They're looking, they're watching, they're absolutely looking at everything that's going on in the world of very early stage hardware and software companies and going, you know, what can we learn from this and how can we learn from it much more cheaply than running our own R&D, essentially. And so if we're better than this, that means that we kind of have to qualify things in a slightly different way. And when people talk about MVP, minimum viable product, online, I think for the hardware world and for the world of products, we kind of have to elevate the quality of what we're doing so that an MVP is actually something that people are capable of buying, discarding, and having opinions about. Something that has defensible IP because whether you like it or not, open source doesn't necessarily allow you to grow a very, very strong business. And I'm very happy to have that conversation with you after that on this particular point. And it's essentially a product that you have to learn from and you have to evolve very, very slowly over time. And we're not in the business of doing things slowly anymore, but that is, atoms are fundamentally more slow than bits. So finally, my final thoughts, crowdfunding is a terrible replacement for real investment. And the UK is not very good at real investment around the Internet of Things, so we're definitely going to suffer from that. There's a lot of large corporations who are very good at doing things that you know, the knowledge is completely absorbed within those industries. And so if they started talking to small players about how you do supply chain management, how you develop a product, how you do user research, we would find that people's ideas will get better and people will actually grow businesses instead of very, very loose projects, which is, it's not a bad thing. It just means that the quality will never really get there because it doesn't have to. And investors should definitely not be the ones dictating how we develop the Internet of Things. Thank you very much.
Hi. So this session is called The New Shape of Things. And what I want to talk about today is what those things are, what the thing in Internet of Things means, and what happens when we go beyond some particular assumptions about what things are. For the record, I really don't like the phrase Internet of Things. It's an important one because it has some traction. It's what people recognize. But I find it othering. It others the things from the network. Are they on a different network? Are they on a different one to their users? The point is how they coexist alongside all the other agents on the actual Internet. So I tend to use the phrase connected objects, and I'm probably going to do that throughout this talk. But I think the same still holds true. What are those objects when we talk about connected objects? I worked on a project last year that explored what it would be like to be in a city where connected objects, street furniture in this case, were connected and part of a network with people. And so today I'm going to talk about the idea that a lamppost is a thing too. So Hello Lamppost was a project I built with Pan Studio. Sam Hill from Pan is in the audience, and Georgi Gallic. And we entered it as a pitch for the inaugural Playable City Award, which was run out of Watershed in Bristol, which Clare runs. And we won the award, which meant we got to run the project last summer for about 2 months. We've also been running a variant of it called Hello Everything at FutureEverything for the past few days. This year, we're lucky enough to say it's been nominated in the digital section of the Design of the Year Award at the Design Museum, so we were down there last week. Watershed explained this award, what a playable city was, like this. They said, a playable city is a city where people, hospitality, and openness are key. enabling its residents and visitors to reconfigure and rewrite its services, places, and stories. It is a place where there is permission to play in public. I really like this quotation because, if the city is a platform of some kind, well, you ought to be able to free to play with it, You ought to be able to wire and connect it as you see fit. Or, to paraphrase the situationists, the playable city is the city built on top of the beach, not the paving stones underneath it. This is human and playful and gentle. It's very much the opposite of ideas about clarity and accuracy and integration and efficiency, which emerge in a particular rhetoric around what's been called smart cities that we've heard a lot about over the past 2 days. Don't know how many of you were with Adam Greenfield at his fireside chat yesterday, but Adam has definitely spoken of his preference for the phrase networked city over capital S, capital C, smart city. And he described the networked city a few years ago as being made of declarative actors and objects and spaces that have their own networked identities and shadows. Smart city is this marketing notion wrapped around off-the-shelf infrastructure. In his chat yesterday, Adam said that, this is the imposition of technology on people. And really, the more important notion is to consider how all the discrete moving parts, the small pieces loosely joined, are connected together. Networked systems, objects, and actors interacting with one another at a distance, over process and through APIs and through legislature. It's also worth noting that many of those declarative actors and objects are not actually always human. I have some prior art with making non-human actors in cities. In 2008, I worked near Tower Bridge in London, and I built this. It's still running, and you might have seen it before. It's a bot, and it sits on Twitter, and it says when Tower Bridge is opening and closing, and what for. It became very evocative for me and my friends. It wasn't just a functional tool, but it's a really emotive one too. Because whenever we leave London, you go overseas, you go to visit your parents, my phone reminds me that the bridge is opening and closing and the city is still there. And really, that's part of the stack it sits on. Not just the stack of the internet and Twitter, but the fact that the city is already a stack of infrastructure and of emotions and memories and of employment. Cab drivers used this so that they would see when the bridge was opening to avoid it. It's like a big jumble of services, the city. It's like Unix. The fundamental unit of connection is the pipe. It was about the first non-human actor I've ever built, and I've lived with it for 6 years now, so it's been interesting to see how it's changed how I feel about the city. Back to the playable city, though. So we very much wanted our playable city to be an antithesis of that smart city. We wanted it to use as much of what was already as possible. We didn't want to impose on people. The city is a surface to build upon. It already has all these layers, the physical above and below ground, the legal, all the digital representations. Adding another one would feel very temporary. And also, when the project was over, it wouldn't leave anything behind. So we had to embrace the existing platform, what was already playable in Bristol. We wanted to hijack the infrastructure, and we spent a lot of time scouring the city for opportunities. We noticed that a lot of street furniture, lampposts, post boxes, bus stops, cranes, bridges, all have these unique reference labels on them. And we thought it would be interesting to see if these could be the way of addressing objects, and these objects could be your intervention with the city. So we turn all of them into actors in the playable city, participants to interact with, to see the city with a new lens through. Just like I'd done with Tower Bridge, we'd find a way to bring them to life that was meaningful, but without actually installing any technology in them. And we also kept coming back to that emotive idea, the city as a physical diary based on the way that returning to places triggers memories. The city is this diary that you walk through. So, London is full of memories for me the first time I met people, where I was when particular events happened. We wanted everyone else to see the city in this way, to be encouraged to share those experiences with each other. And so that had to be as accessible to as many people as possible because, it has to work for the most people at the largest scale. It's not a playable city if not everyone's allowed to play. So, we didn't go down the route of building an app for smartphones because that already is a massive filter on who can play. By contrast, everybody understands SMS. Every mobile phone has SMS. It's so easy to implement now. So, it's superficially unexciting, but it gives us this massive range of people we can deal with. Similarly, we weren't going to use GPS because that would limit the audience. If we just used text messaging and these codes, anyone could play. I jokingly said at the time that the smart city uses technology and systems to work out what its citizens are doing. and the playable city would just ask you what you were up to, which is very similar to Ima's near-future cities she was talking about this morning, their interactive, communicative style. So what did we end up with? We ended up with a playful experience where you could message street furniture, hold a dialogue with it, and see what other people had been saying. Here's a short film that explains this. To induct people into this, we had to make it legible, because otherwise it's an invisible system. So we were very lucky to be supported with just some display advertising. And these were our hero objects. What's brilliant about them is the entire rules of the experience are on them. It says text, hello, lamppost, #HR84 to this phone number to talk to me. That's everything you had to do. And off you went. Most people did interact with these yellow objects first, but many would then go on to play with the rest of the city now that they'd understood it. And this is sort of what a conversation looks like. You can see someone talking to a postbox. It knows about the weather. It asks them some questions, and it tells them what other people have said to other postboxes. By engaging in our little intervention, we hoped people might understand all the other Bristols that exist for its other citizens, see the world differently. Not just the other street objects they might otherwise pass by, but also the other perspectives they might not see. How did a lamppost in a poorer area of town hear different things to its brothers and sisters on the waterfront? Well, we could find out because the same system worked everywhere for everyone. Perhaps it would expose similarities and differences. It ran for 2 months last summer, and we've had just under 4,000 players over that run, who collectively engaged in nearly 10,000 conversations, speaking with over 1,000 objects. And we sent about and received about 25,000 text messages. It's actually currently running again at the Design Museum because we have to have it in the air, so you can still go and see it. But really, I'm less interested in the numbers than what people said, the qualitative aspects. What was it going to bring out? And it brought everything from the poetic, as you can see in this first example, to very personal and emotive things in the second. And even, witty, entertaining things. If I was yours for the day, said the billboard, what would you write on me? Be excellent to each other. Well, why am I telling you about a playful SMS toy in a session on connected objects? Well, I think it's important to consider the interactions and the ideas here as part of this continuum of connected objects. We were clearly making something that had an element of smoke and mirrors to it, but these were real interactions that real people had. It was real things they said, and they were standing by real objects in the urban environment. Matt Webb from Berg nominated this for Designs of the Year, and in the plaque by the exhibit, he says he thinks it's a poetic glimpse of what the future of user interaction will be in the Internet of Things, a technological vision where artifacts and physical environments are connected to the network. And that's exactly what I hoped people would take away from it, not just the charming, playful, poetic joy, but also the idea that you could interact with the city in a way beyond apps and dashboards, something light and social and conversational. If there's one thing I want you to take away today from me prattling at you, it's this: that I don't think connected objects are just white goods with a Wi-Fi antenna. That's a real focus we have right now, especially in the consumer sector. These are luxury products for an early adopter audience that cost a bit more than it would if it didn't have the internet in it. Some of them are very well designed, and some of them are really useful. They're good products, but they're not the limits of what connected objects can be. And so I think the largest audience for connected objects right now is for civic objects with shared usage, the networked city. This is probably the most commonly used connected object in London. It's actually a bus stop and it's broken. And everyone loves taking this picture because the bus stop's showing you the IP address, it's not working, it's on the network. That's amazing, it's on the network. It has an internet connection and by and large it's showing you the right data. In fact, they're taking a picture of what makes it amazing. Nobody owns it. It's not a luxury item. It's a timetable made vastly more useful through network connectivity and then through situating it in the place you use it. In this case, Elephant and Castle. And my mum has a similar timetable at her park and ride in another town. And it's not on the network. It's just an animation. It is a clock that is right twice a day because it's awful. And it sits there and she doesn't trust it anymore. I had to explain that these ones are usually correct when they're not broken. This is a part of what Adam called the network city, not a giant system, but separate objects, all with networked identities. The buses have GPS and a network connection to tell the system where they are. The system updates the displays as appropriate. And also, of course, all the public APIs it supplies to developers and the private APIs it supplies to its own systems. These objects are working together. They're all part of larger things. And Tower Bridge is another networked actor now. Although, one interesting thing, it can have a meaningful presence in the network without being connected. This doesn't tweet the second its motors spring into life and those bridges start moving. It's just my server tweeting a bit before the timetable says it's due to open. Except, to all extents and purposes, that data representation feels pretty much the same as if it really were connected. It's a mirror. What makes it feel like the bridge is tweeting is not the reality of that, it's just that it talks in the first person, which is actually very important. On Twitter, you answer the question, what are you doing? And we all talk in the first person. And so the bridge should too. If we're going to put systems on it, they need to behave a bit like us. But once they do, it feels like it's a very natural home for it. It's a really nice proof that this identity, the idea that this representation in the mirror world represents the object, isn't necessarily related to whether the data is literally coming from the object itself. When we interact with Hello Lamppost and with Tower Bridge, we don't care that there's not a network cable going to every post box in Bristol, because it feels and behaves as if it is. There's also no dissimulation here. We're not pretending that it is. That's quite critical. And of course, the experience has to hold up. If it falls down because I got the time zone on the server wrong, which I did once, it all breaks instantly and everyone knows it's a fraud. But sometimes joined up is as good as connected. And networks of things and of personal relationships can go beyond network cables. Our interactions with connected objects always tip over into this mirror world of data. And those data sources and the services they sit on top of extend far beyond the physical tip of the iceberg. This is an avatar for something much larger than itself, the service it sits on top of. And this is a terminology first used by Mike Kuniavsky in 2010, I think. Connected objects done right are rarely just a device as a network connection. They're a material representation of a system. This is why we all like Instagram so much. It's a camera with my friends in alongside me. By putting upload and sharing into the camera, it stops being just a camera. It becomes a manifestation of that whole service of take, share, browse, and comment. And it also makes every other camera feel a bit broken. The bus stop is another avatar for TfL. It gives you factual information, but it's also an avatar of the whole platform. The buses, the APIs, London Transit. It's a synecdoche, the part standing for the whole. TfL are currently doing this experiment with Clear Channel, a display media firm, to trial real-time information displays. You can see it here, and it's this big touchscreen. And it feels maybe a bit better than an improvement on the previous version, but it's still just a shared display. And the success of all those connected objects we saw earlier is that they are personal. They give direct benefit to one user. Civic objects need to have some kind of personal focus. I'm not going to put where I'm going into this system so the person behind me can follow me home. However, there are interactions you can design around connected objects that are personal, functional, and two-way. Why not an email from a station I passed through in the morning, just to let me know it has severe delays in case I'm going back that way tonight? You know, this only shows me how I can get from one stop to somewhere on the route. What if I want to get to the other side of town? Why can't I just text it and find out? Because I don't want that guy standing behind me to follow me. Why isn't my hire bike more like a pigeon or a cat? And it always knows its way home to the nearest empty bike rack, even if I don't know where that is. What would that object be like if it was connected and illustrating that data? And this is a prototype I'm building at the moment. It should be finished this month. Just to see what it feels like sat on a bike. What if Citymapper wasn't in my £500 mobile phone, but in the city, manifesting in the objects it describes? Because the data's there from the official sources. How radically strange it is when the objects that you use are also connected to the network and to that information. But there's one final thing I want to talk about, which is that once you come to the idea of how objects manifest services, or how services manifest in objects, we can move away from just plain old interaction patterns of using them like we used to before. And there's one pattern that always comes up, which I call big stick and binoculars. First of all, binoculars. I can see the control panel on a device from further away, say on my mobile phone. And then when I can see it from further away, I've got a big stick, just like Archimedes had, and I can control it from further away and turn it on. That gets you the two canonical smart objects, the Cambridge University Computer Lab coffee pot and the Teasmade. These are good products. These are not bad. And there are many products based around big sticks, such as Alex's Goodnight lamp, that are very subtle and interesting because of the context they apply to that. But remember that once you start thinking about how you can integrate with the service it represents, what are the entirely new interactions you can design? So you look at something like glow caps. Glow caps is this cap, it sits on top of a pill bottle, and it reminds you when to take your pills, and sort of lets you know when you're running out, and it won't let you take them too often, and so forth. It doesn't just replace the function of a safety lid, but with electronics, but it hooks into all the systems it represents, refilling your prescription at the pharmacy, distributing the medication according to what your doctor said, notifying your caregivers when you haven't taken your pills, and frankly, integrating with America's insidious health insurance schemes. And the latter aside, it's compelling because it's not just a big stick or binoculars deployed without context, but simply because we can. It's a product taken into a connected and networked realm. Now, that might all feel a lot to come from what happens when you let people text message lamps for 2 months. But I think the potential for connected objects, for the Internet of Things, is most interesting at its broadest, most democratic, and most social edge. When we're thinking about making connected objects and things on the Internet, rather than just what objects can we most easily connect, diversity and ingenuity in considering what could be an object, what might be a thing, is critical. Not just things with Wi-Fi, but things that are radically different for being connected and that anyone can engage with. Thank you very much.
Alex needs a stick mic. So I might have lied. I might ask one question and then I'll come out. But I really am hoping there'll be lots of conversation. We've got just under half an hour. And I wanted to start by asking you all about kind of how you create diversity and ingenuity, as you said, Tom, in the market. Because we've talked about connected objects that assert control, that technology is an imposition. We've talked about surveillance. And it seems that, and we've talked about mystery and presence and ambiguity and the things that do this a little bit better. And it seems it's all about the experiences that wrap around the objects as much as the objects themselves. So how do we create learning environments, platforms, places, investors who understand how to foster diversity and ingenuity? Can you phone a friend? You could have anyone? Alex, I mean, this Tinker It in some ways, like the very start of this was also about some of the creating an ecology.
Yes, I think. It's been a while. I was going to say, I think it's actually dangerous to think that the kind of service layer and the experience is completely isolatable, that's not even a word, from the product, because then, you know, the product is the experience first, and then what happens after happens to be a sort of, on a good day, is life-changing. So glow caps is a real example of that. On, you know, a bad day is actually preventing you from using the object because the data bit gets in the way, and then somewhere in the middle doesn't make a difference. So if my jewelry happens to be connected to the internet, that's one thing, but that it makes me look good matters more right now, because it's jewelry. Whereas when it's medical bottles that I don't actually want to show anybody, then the functionality sort of trumps the object itself. The problem with disassociation of data and product, which we will, I think, move more and more towards, is that we are therefore emotionally disassociating ourselves from the products. And what happens with that is waste, because then the product, just like the devices that we have right now, we kind of go through, a generation after generation of products and devices and very metal heavy and extremely, unrecyclable products, because the service layer is more important than the product itself. Because the product itself is a screen for the digital interactions I have. Will I have the same reflex with jewelry? Hopefully not, because there's an interaction there, there's an emotional landscape there that's far richer. But with pill bottles or items which already I don't have a very strong relationships with, then we might break that and just make those objects care or matter even less. And that's quite interesting and potentially very wasteful.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of lucky in that whilst I can come from a prototyping engineer's perspective and definitely come from a philosophical angle, I'm not trying to mass manufacture anything myself at the moment, and so as a result I don't necessarily have nearly as much of a foot to stand on. I definitely think that a lot of this is going to be about the product sector both upping their game and collaborating well. I think a lot of the first movers here, from my perspective, and you may disagree, are coming from that very rapid, very lean space. But actually, as Alex said in her talk, there's a lot of experience in this sector out there. They're pretty good at making things at a big scale. The problem is what the ideas are. And I do also think that the things that make services compelling, I was thinking as Alex said that about the services I'm very emotionally tied to, that I was very sad. I'm sad when they close, or I want my data out of. But that feeling, it's definitely important to me, and it's a totally different shape feeling to the products I like and enjoy. And I think I think you're right, no amount of wonderful service under it sometimes matters if it doesn't feel right in my hand or look like a thing I want to share. I think it's just going to be a continual edging forward in both cases. But there are so many things tied up in your question too, because you said, how do we get investors to also care about this? And that's another big issue. There's an education not just for all the people with an Arduino and a PHP website who've suddenly realized that doing this for more than 50 things is hard, but there's also a lesson for the people trying to fund this, and actually the amount of money it's going to take and the time for ROI is not the same as it is for a software startup. And it's actually also not the same as it just is to make, say, a nice injection molded object or a carved object, because there are so many more moving parts.
So creating good, diverse things, that's kind of a big problem. To make them good, one thing you can do is just reduce the number of stakeholders. So like the My Guide interactive touchscreen guide to Manchester combined with Billboard, you've got the touchscreen bit, which is like beautifully done by Magnetic North. It's very considerate of user needs, what people want when they're going around the city, what they want to find. But then you've got like this big bit on the side, which is like an advertiser who has a completely different aim. They just want people to like look at an advert rather than help them navigate the city. It's in their interest to make you stop and look at the billboard rather than to carry on to where you want to go. And you could have just built the touchscreen without the advertising bit, but you've added extra stakeholders in. Because capitalism, I guess.
Which is, that was something that we were sharing over lunch. Recently I was presenting Playable City and Hello Lamppost, and somebody came up to us and said they made a womble object, which was kind of great. It was in America. It took a bit of a while to explain what a womble was to the audience, but the idea that a womble object or a big stick, in fact, is something that does one thing really well and really elegantly, and I wonder if that's the space we're in, or whether these things can have more than one use or meaning.
They can, but in the same way everything else does. One of my earliest memories, my mum, when she would tell friends she was coming around to visit, would phone them and hang up after 3 rings. Some people will instantly remember doing that, and some people will think I'm crazy. But I really remember this and thinking, that's not a feature. It's an affordance of how phones work. Again, let's talk about Alex's product. Goodnight lamp, it's just a lamp and it doesn't tell you what it does. It doesn't have a light, it doesn't have a little e-ink display saying, what does it mean this time? And it doesn't have a color changer at the moment. It might do one day. But that idea of going, here is a thing, and we're not going to tell you what it means and what it signifies, is very different to prescribed switches and buttons for everything. And that feels like a question of product design to me, and lots of things that have lasted and had long impacts have been used in a variety of ways. And things which are proscriptive, things which have one switch for everything, things which don't have a multitude of back ends, or things which cannot be repaired, end up on those landfill and scrap heaps really fast. That, to me, it's a good way of pulling out the emotive stories, I guess, that make people connect to objects. That's what's going to be, those are the stories that people hook onto. What does the pill cap lid do? What does that light coming on mean? And I think actually any good product, whether it's got a network connection or not, if it can explain itself in those terms and not just say, here is what I do, but here is what I could do. And people go, I know what I would do with that. I know where I would put that. I know how I would use it. That's great, and that's what makes things attractive and desirable. And also, you know it'll have a longer lifespan because you can see the many things you can do with it. And so actually, that's sort of why those simple use things come to mind, because otherwise, you either move into a space where there's more landfill, or where things just, people grow out of them. They no longer need them if it wasn't quite right. They can't grow with them.
Before Alex and Dan come in, if you've got a question, a provocation, a heckle, please raise your hands high so that we can see you. And I'll let you guys just finish on that while people raise if you've got anything else to add.
I was going to say, I think I tweeted just before I came up saying I hope that there's some materials scientists who are looking into this space, because there are really good reasons why we've ended up with the things we've ended up in and the cities we've ended up in, because we're actually really comfortable with single-use objects because we know how to fit them. Not only do we know how to fit them in our lives, but we also, people know how to sell them to us, and there are shelves that are the right height for those objects, because then people design to those shelves. And we not only have the object itself, but we have the retail experience to go with it, the distribution layer to go with it, and the production mechanisms to go with it. And so when you then start to sort of mash things up together, you could do one of two things, I think. You could do, if you're from North America, you would know what this means. I don't think that brand exists here, but Starfrit do a range of hyper-specific kitchen products. So, you know, a peeler, you can get an apple peeler, a pear peeler, an orange peeler, like hyper-specific. And they just try to sell you on the boredom of buying something in a shop for, you know, a quid. And you just kind of go like, oh, come on. I'll just get one of these and we'll give them as a gift to my grandmother. And they kind of feed on that hyper specificity has found a place in the market. And then you have devices, broadly speaking, which are very, very good at the multiple stuff. And then we know how to sort of oscillate between the two. I think the Internet of Things is possibly trying to be somewhere in the middle, and that's quite strange. I think it feels quite strange because it's playing with preconceived ideas about what you can do with the objects you are trying to embed with technology. So in our case, we have a lamp. And, you know, we don't try to do too many things with the lamp because we know that a lamp should just work as a lamp first and then do interesting things later. And do interesting things as kind of almost a side effect of the connectivity. But if it doesn't work as a lamp first, you know, we don't have a product. Because that is an interaction that people will understand and will understand on and off. And everything else in the magic that happens after that is it's not that it's a nice to have, it's just, it's great to have. It's like, oh, great, that's fantastic. But I also really like how this works and what this does, because I get it. So.
Do you want anything? There's a question waiting, please.
First of all, thank you very much, all of you. That was fascinating. Alexandra, you raised it very quickly in your talk, but I want to ask about crowdsourcing, and you mentioned Oculus Rift, and there's been a few things over the last couple of years on Kickstarter where either products have been launched and then not come out, or then they've then been sold to big companies, and like in the case of Oculus Rift, and people then feel a little bit shortchanged. So I wanted to ask your opinion on how crowdsourcing is impacting people making those objects at an early stage, and whether the expectations that come along with crowdsourcing and or investment put a higher risk on your first iteration and your first early designs. Does it have to be right the first time as a result of those things?
If you ask a question, could you sort of stand up and make a big wave? That's it, cool, because it sounds like you're behind us at the moment, which is a bit weird. Alex?
Super quickly, I think that the sort of real challenge is that you, generally speaking, unless you're extremely well prepared and you're extremely strategic about what you're doing, you don't know what you're getting yourself into when you do crowdfunding. You're kind of after a small amount of money because you want to see what how the market responds to what you do, is the not ideal scenario, but the kind of innocent scenario. And then you have people who are, doing this by maths and who know when to launch a campaign, how much to raise, who they're going to go after, in terms of investment. They've already spoken to investors before they do the crowdfunding. This is their third crowdfunded thing, and they're just going for numbers. And so you've got everything in between. And so it's very hard to talk about a general entrepreneur, because that doesn't exist anymore. I think the thing that people fundamentally understand about crowdfunding, or should understand about crowdfunding, is that it's not a funding tool, it is a marketing tool. And the second that you separate yourself, you kind of separate yourself from that as it's an illusion to think that you can fund hardware properly through a small campaign, or even a large campaign. The mechanics of it don't work, the numbers don't work, it's marketing. You will get a sense of how popular your thing might be with a particular community, because the crowdfunding community is not every single buyer you might have. The populations are very different. But so it's a particular audience, and you'll get a sense of whether that particular audience likes what you do. That's about all you can say that crowdfunding is good for in the hardware space. I think it's very successful in the photography, film, kind of creative arts space. I think it's very successful as funding mechanisms. For hardware, it's, that's not what's going on. Again, if people fundamentally disagree, use Twitter. I shall respond.
Pete.
Sorry, over here. I have a strangely sort of negative reaction to this that I can't quite pin down, a sort of emotional reaction. I don't really know why, so I'm just going to say one of the issues I think I've had with startup culture, apart from the sort of connections into venture capitalism and evil, is that a lot of services and things that I've used in the past no longer exist, and the domains have expired and they've just gone. So, and most of my blog is basically full of link rot. So how do we avoid? And this, you were talking about products that in rapid prototype, you get them out there, and then they stop working and everything vanishes. How do we deal with that really annoying link rot in the Internet of Things? I suppose
you should trademark that. Link rot in the Internet of Things. I don't think there's a good mechanism for it right now, because people are getting money for things they probably should never be getting money for, if that makes sense. And so you will get people who are early adopters of a thing that then lasts 6 months because they burn through their cash and the team fundamentally disagrees on something, everybody breaks apart and they all go their merry way, and you're left with an object that doesn't have a digital layer anymore and was only good because of that digital layer. I'm not sure how that's solved particularly well with the funding mechanisms around right now. I think it's like that super early stage of like craziness, and eventually things settle down. Like there's kind of a plateau after the early excitement, and I don't know if this is a Gartner chart type, thing that happens.
I mean, there is also a point, of course, that actually there's a lot of other places where things don't die quickly enough, and where like euthanasia is massively needed. The cultural sector might be a really good place to look for a place where euthanasia is needed. So actually, some of that turnover and it might be healthy. Dan.
It's definitely a problem. Like, I've got a Nabaz tag from a few years ago, and it's a doorstop now. Like, the company went bust, got bought out, rebranded, got bought out, went bust, and like, it's a thing, it's a brick now. The entire web service behind it is gone. And so there's kind of jailbreakers who built like replacement backends for it, and you have to like install it on a server, and then that broke, and the people who maintain it and wrote it have disappeared, and all the documentation's in French. So like, it's a mess. So one possibility is to build these things with open services, but that's less user-friendly. Like, how do you make a product that's completely open, that can exist in a market where you have to buy things for money, and that still keep working after they're dead, when that's not a thing people look at when they're buying it? I can't see an easy solution. I can just see a big pile of problems. Especially, it's not just services going bust, it's the service changing after you've bought the object. So an example is the Chumby, which is this little beanbag screen thing, and it shows you widgets like tweets and stuff. And a year after you bought it, it changed and started showing adverts in between the things that you told it to show. And like, you couldn't opt out of this, it just did it. The thing you owned changed.
I was going to say to that, I think there's a really interesting thing emerging in crowdfunding, and you're seeing it a lot, especially right now. Now lots of things are maturing, which is, I sometimes wonder if consumers know what they're actually doing when they spend money on a crowdfunding site, and then similarly if people selling things on crowdfunding sites know what they're selling. Because there is an interesting thing about many things, I think Alex's point about, lots of stuff is getting made, to be honest, wouldn't get made a while ago, and we wouldn't waste our money on a thing because it wouldn't exist. But there is this awkward interaction between someone seeing a thing and going, yes, that is literally, that's not a little plastic prototype. That is the thing I have been waiting for 8 years, and it solves my problems, and I actually desire it. And the people making it are going, yeah, it would be really nice if we could make this. It would be great if we could get some funding, just get it out, maybe make 1,000. And the next thing they know, they're working out how hard machine tooling works because they need to make 100,000, and it's not quite as good as they were planning on. And yet the emotional interaction between a consumer and the product is not the one they intended. And it's fascinating watching people negotiate the minefield of people not delivering on time, things not being delivered as they were, things taking longer than they took because it turns out the people manufacturing it don't know how it works, and now we're into things being bought out before the Kickstarter's even over, and lots of unhappy people realizing that when they get the small print quoted back at them, that wasn't the emotive interaction they had when they saw an Oculus Rift Dev Kit 2 and went, brilliant, I missed the first time, I'm going to get in on this. So there's lots of interesting questions about actually the things being bought. We're buying things that we possibly wouldn't have bought really before, or we're spending money that we might have saved before, and the things being offered to us possibly aren't quite as finished as the things we're paying for. It's very similar in some ways to all these web services that people have taken on for free and then maybe they've been closed or bought out. It's a weird world of consumerism right now.
Anab, I just have one question, a couple of questions actually. One is why, I'm just curious, I really like the idea of playful cities, but why should all our infrastructure start talking to us? And for how, like if we were to draw out the scenario into the future, into the long future, and we have lots of things talking to us, what would that mean? When would it result in fatigue? What are the expectations we start having from our infrastructure? And so on. And the second question is, why do we need to anthropomorphize our infrastructure? Why do we need to, this concept of mirroring, why should it have a human-like personality? We anyway anthropomorphize objects in our daily lives. And I'm just curious.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I can give two quick answers.
I think, and also if we could do quickish answers on
quick.
both, because they're pretty
So,
heavy.
First of all, I don't necessarily, I think we were using it a bit as a placeholder. That was very much designed to be playful, and so talking seemed good. I don't think I'd advocate the entire city permanently doing it. It helped that it was a limited-run institution, and dialogue isn't always the best tool for this. I will say, though, that people engage with it quite well, and certainly Bristol City Council saw this and said, this would be a great way of people reporting something that was wrong with the road. You can still do it, but the fact it's embodied and situated in that space, just going, hey, this place is broken to a nearby object that has a thing on it, works quite well. Secondly, anthropomorphism, and you can grab me afterwards to talk about this. Anthropomorphism isn't actually what I would say it is. They never dissimulate, they never pretend to be human. They can speak, they speak like us. The only things they know are things they would likely know, such as the time of day and the weather that's falling on their head. But they don't have feelings, they have memory, they remember when they've seen you. And I think it's really important to separate out maybe the idea of something pretending to be a person and something being very at ease with its thingness that happens to speak in English.
But that's where the tension is, because we want to innovate design agency. In a sense, there's a view that at some point these objects might start having a certain agency. Or
yes,
is that...
and at the moment I can tell you in the way the system's built, because I made it, they're not alive. I wrote lots of lines of code into a computer.
No, but I think it's pointing to a design fiction of the uncanny valley, where we can imagine that if we start to imbue these things, we might make them in that way, I guess. Dan, do you want to...
When you ask why anthropomorphization, all I can think of is Hilary Dixon's quote that anthropomorphization is a foolish meat weakness. It's like a vulnerability in the human system that we see things that look like people or animals, and we kind of want to empathize with it, which means it's kind of a vulnerability in the human system that someone can exploit. So if you're building something shitty and evil, put a smiley face on it, and everything's good. Matt Jones points out when you see videos of the Big Dog, the walking weapons systems DARPA funded Boston Dynamics to do, and someone kicks it, pushes it over, you feel really sorry for it because its legs stumble and it tries to not fall over, and it's a military weapon.
I think empathy is a weakness, but I think it's one of the good kinds of weaknesses, and it leads to lots of nice things in the world, like art. And unfortunately, one of the problems with Hello Lamppost is it's slightly art. It's not entirely designed around functionality, but it's a useful provocation. To be honest, I would never take the anthropomorphization further, and I've definitely seen things where it's it can't pretend to be alive. It has to almost acknowledge that it doesn't even know how it can do this. It's a really complex tension, and I think it has to be kept in tension to be powerful. It can't slip too far into endless functional services or personalities or being grumpy. They don't have moods, and we decided that really early on because that's just irritating, and it would be a lie that I'd invented.
Alex, any closing thoughts, as I promised to bring us down on time?
Nope.
Marvellous. Well, you could probably take away, I'm sure, if you're building something shitty, then put a smile on it. Thank you very much, Dan, Tom, and Alex.